So in that 50-year period or so, 40 years, when it was when Franklin D. Roosevelt issued 6102, Executive Order 6102, to make it illegal to own gold for average citizens, they took the gold, they valued it at $20 an ounce, right? And then from that period on until Nixon, well, I guess it wasn't Nixon that allowed Americans to own gold again, right? It was
Oh, no. It comes later, after Nixon, in I think it was Ford. It's 1973. And I guess the theory was that it didn't make any difference. The average person was now so divorced from any understanding of a gold and silver monetary system that it wouldn't make any difference if the average citizen had access to ownership of gold. And they were right, because nothing happened. You didn't see a huge groundswell of people saying, well, now we want to have gold clause contracts. We want to deal in these things again.
Do you think
And
it was
1985, you had, just before that, you had the Gold Commission. Ron Paul was one of the people on the Gold Commission. He's, I guess, a minority figure on the Gold Commission in terms of his attitude. And the question there was, what, if anything, should be the role of gold in a modern monetary system? And really, the only thing they came up with was the idea that there should be a gold coin minted by the United States, because theoretically, the vast majority of gold coins that had been out there had been seized by the government and melted down in the Roosevelt era and put in bars in Fort Knox. All right, and the ones that were still floating around in collectors' collections, there was a special part of the statutes that allowed that, and those things weren't circulating as actual money. So under the Gold Commission, there was a proposal to mint new gold coins, which they did, the American Eagle series. And there was a proposal to mint a new silver coin, which they did, the American Liberty silver dollar, so-called. And that silver dollar was not of the constitutional standard, but we can leave that aside because everything Congress did since the 1930s was not of the constitutional standard. And obviously the gold coins weren't of the constitutional standard. And this is where the whole story becomes interesting, because those coins were specifically made legal tender by the statutes under which they were issued. And they were given specific dollar denominations. There was a $50 gold coin, there was a $20 gold coin, 10, 5, so forth, and the $1 silver coin. And the prohibition against gold clause contracts had earlier been removed in 1971. So when these new coins started coming out, it was conceivable that people could go back in their normal commercial transactions in the marketplace and deal on a gold and silver monetary basis. You make a gold clause contract which says this contract can be paid solely in, and then you specify what type of currency you're going to use. And there was no question. The courts had never changed their rules about the enforcement of such contracts. They said that all the way back from the 1860s, 1870s, there had never been a change in that. They said if you had one of these contracts that was legal, then it had to be enforced according to its terms, and it had to be paid in gold, even if you went into court to enforce the payment. So if you went into court and the court said, well, you owe $10 under this contract, that $10 had to be paid in gold, not in paper currency.
If it was a gold clause contract.
Because there was a gold clause in the contract. So these were, at that point in time, these were probably the most secure monetary contracts you could possibly make, because you had the statutes defining the particular gold and silver coins. These gold and silver coins were made legal tender. They were made currency of the United States. And you had this long line of, all the way to Supreme Court decisions saying how these contracts had to be enforced. What happened, of course, was nobody paid any attention to that.
So nobody was using those gold clause contracts.
No, absolutely not. Well, I imagine there were some people in interstitial situations that they used it, but it wasn't as if all of a sudden the dam burst. People realized, well, now we can do this, and we can make these very financially secure arrangements. Let's start doing. No, none of that happened.
Well, why do you think people accepted Executive Order 6102? I mean, we're like going back into their mindset. They're in between World War I. They don't know World War II is coming. They're in the midst of the Depression. Stock markets crashed. hot mass unemployment. Do you think it was that made people not stand up against this and revolt, or what do you think it was that caused people to not have a second revolution when they tried to take everybody's gold?
Well, number one, I seriously doubt that people understood the monetary system. That's point number one, constitutional monetary system. And then number two, not understanding that, they wouldn't have understood how that monetary system was vital to the maintenance of constitutional limitations on government. That's why it's there. It's not there because the founders were enamored of gold and silver. They wanted a control on the national government and the state governments so that they couldn't engage in inflationary policies through paper currency, because the states and the Continental Congress had engaged in vastly inflationary policies during the War of Independence. The founding fathers had great experience with this. It was like Weimar Germany in a sense. They knew precisely what would happen under those circumstances because they themselves, in many instances, were the authors of those circumstances. So they put these limitations into the Constitution in order to control the ability of government to use inflationary policies to suck resources out of the general population in a surreptitious fashion, other than through taxation on the one hand or legitimate borrowing on the other hand. And I could go into great detail about the way the Constitution was written to prevent all those things from happening. But nobody understood that by the time they arrived at 1932. The average person didn't understand that, number one.
Right.
Number two, what happened during World War I? All sorts of extreme things happened under World War I. I mean, they suppressed freedom of speech. They put people into prison for 10 years for questioning the legitimacy of the war. It was unbelievable what was done under Woodrow Wilson. Right? And people went along with that. War powers, right? National emergency, all that nonsense. And then, of course, you had the equivalent of that under Roosevelt with the Depression. In fact, Roosevelt used the Trading with the Enemy Act, which had been passed for World War I purposes, as his initial justification for controlling gold transactions and seizing gold. Even though the Supreme Court had earlier said the Trading with the Enemy Act didn't apply during peacetime, didn't make any difference. And if you look at what happened in Congress, Roosevelt's people were writing statutes over in the executive branch, and they were sending them over to Congress, and the proponents of these, the sponsors, were saying, oh, we don't even need to read this. The President of the United States has said this is what we need to do. Let's just pass it. And that's right in the congressional. I'm not making this up. This is right in the congressional record. You can read the speeches, if they were called speeches. You could read the colloquies that went on. Somebody on the minority side, generally Republican, would say, wait a minute, we have to consider this. Someone on the Democratic side was a sponsor. Oh, no, this is a terrific emergency. We have to go along with whatever the president tells us to do. And so they did it.
Kind of like then, of course, the CARES Act.
Well, it's the same as today. All right, we're having the same thing here with the COVID-19 business, all right, on a much larger scale, because it's going on with the various governors as well as the people in the executive branch of government. And then you had the loss of historical knowledge between the 1930s and the 1970s and 1980s. All those people who might have understood this subject, who were educated in the early 1900s or maybe a little bit earlier, had a higher level of constitutional knowledge. Where were they? Well, they were dead. And where were the people in the 1970s who were now young adults or adults? Well, they were people who were brought up under Roosevelt, Truman, and so forth and so on. This whole series of presidents exercising various kinds of emergency powers of one sort or another under a monetary system which derived from what? 1932. So the average person in the 1970s, 1980s, he had no knowledge of what was pre-1932 unless he happened to be a monetary historian of some kind. And those were obviously a very small number of people, because when the gold clause contracts were made legitimate again, and when gold and silver coin were being minted by the Treasury in large amounts, essentially nobody took advantage of that. And that was, I think, the ultimate reason why the financial powers that be let that happen. They knew that they could do this with no real danger to the system they had created, because there weren't enough people to take advantage of it. There would never be a real competition between the gold and silver monetary system and the fiat Federal Reserve monetary system. And we see that even today.
So in the mindset of somebody back then, how many people, because when they tried to do prohibition, obviously people didn't give in to that, and there were people still bootlegging and everything. How many people do you think actually didn't give their gold and just held on to it? at risk of going to jail and getting $10,000 fines and all this stuff.
The estimates are that approximately 50% of the gold coinage that the Treasury believed was out in the market somewhere was never turned in.
See, I thought that it was that they did the Executive Order 6102 in order to print their way out of the Depression and prevent draining of the Treasury by the citizens, so that they could inflate the money supply, use it to stimulate loans and all that stuff, and print their way out of the Depression, and that the people couldn't say, all right, well, now I want to get some gold for all this money, because they're making doubling the supply of money or whatever, and they don't have all the gold.
But they did that by revaluing the gold coinage. Gold went from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce. So there was your gold inflation.
Was that like pretty much the next day? Like they just decreed it one day?
No, it took Roosevelt a while, because they went on from 20 to 22 to 25 and so forth. No, and it was arbitrary. He would come up with numbers. He and Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of Treasury, would come up with numbers every other day until they finally hit on 35.
And why did they do that? Because citizens couldn't actually redeem for the gold anymore. So were they just doing that for the international community to use dollars as a currency?
Well, primarily, I suppose that would have to be. The thing that always interested me about it was, you go from 20 to 35, and there was a limit. Congress said that he couldn't inflate the price of gold by more than 60%. But if you look
How
at the
generous.
Well, I know. If you look at the actual gold-silver ratio at the time, if he had corrected the valuation of gold versus the market valuation of silver,